Guys, today we're going to talk about the Second Amendment. There's the misinterpreted side, and then there's this side. Hey guys, we're going to take a really close look at the Second Amendment today. We're going to go into some pretty good detail. We're going to talk, not a whole lot about the Federalist Papers, but we're going to talk a lot about case law and things that have developed over the years in terms of from the time the Second Amendment was actually established until now. Now, the first thing I'm going to ask you guys, and I rarely do this, is if you're watching this video, please do us a favor and share this video. Please take the link, put it wherever you can, post it wherever you can, Facebook, if you can link to it somehow on Instagram, Twitter, if you can like it, on YouTube, share it. Anything is helpful because what we're trying to do is disseminate some accurate information out there. First thing we're going to do is we are going to look at the words in the Second Amendment, okay? I'm going to read these out. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Okay, first thing we're going to do is we're going to do what I like to say is break the Second Amendment up into two parts. The Second Amendment is not just one part. It seems like a run-on sentence, but commas are there for a reason. I know punctuation is a little confusing to a lot of people out there because, let's face it, social media has made it to where people abbreviate words. They can't take the time to spell out the word you, Y-O-U. It's just spelled with a U, a letter U anymore. And I have read run-on sentences on our YouTube posts that have absolutely no punctuation in it, let alone a capital letter. So we're actually going to break this down. It is sectioned off into two sections. It's actually got a prefatory statement and an operative statement. Let me explain what those mean. The first part of the Second Amendment again reads, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. However you want to interpret that, all I know is it does mean a militia, whether it be a militia to defend against foreign threats or against a tyrannical government. I think it can serve both purposes, to be quite honest with you. I don't see why it's one or the other. So that's the first part of the Second Amendment. Again, this is the Preparatory Clause. This portion of the Second Amendment is giving rights to a militia to exist. An armed militia, obviously, has to be armed in order for it to be an actual militia. But we're going to go into one of these case law studies here in a second, and we're going to be able to talk a little bit more about what our founding fathers either meant or what the Supreme Court has interpreted as to what they meant here in a second. Now, let's move on to the operative clause of the Second Amendment. This clause is the second part, and it states, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. This part of the amendment is where you and I get our individual rights. It's the second part of the amendment. Remember, the prefatory clause at the beginning of the Second Amendment, that was establishing the right of a militia to exist as a group, a collective unit, the militia. That's giving the militia as a collective unit, again, the right to protect the country, protect against tyrannical rule, whatever. Again, this operative clause now is giving me and you our rights. It's a second portion of the Second Amendment. It's not the same part. It's not, even though there's a comma separating it, it's totally separate from that prefatory clause. And again, it's giving us individual rights to keep and bear arms. The militia, it's a given that the militia is going to have arms. It's not a militia without arms. They're specifying in the second part of the Second Amendment that we have individual rights to keep and bear arms. Now, in case there was any kind of confusion about what arms, keeping them, and bearing them means, let's look at the dictionary. We're going to look at a dictionary that has existed, according to their website, since 1828, Merriam-Webster's Dictionary. Let's first look at arms. Let's see what arms are. Let's roll through here. Here we go. The second definition of arm is to furnish or equip with weapons. That's what we're talking about. We're going to move on to keep. Remember, we can keep and bear arms. Keep and bear weapons. Here we go. The very first definition of keep, to retain in one's possession or power. Let's go to bear. Now, obviously, the first definition is probably going to be a noun of the actual animal, the bear. Yep, there we go. It's a bear. We understand what you are. We get it. Okay, here we go. Oh, well, yeah, this is definitely it. To physically carry, the right of the people to keep and bear arms. It's actually in there as part of the definition for bear. Again, the definition of the verb bear means to physically carry, the right of the people to keep and bear arms. We've defined what arms means, what keep means, and what bear means. All right, let me explain something real quick here. You know, you hear the term constitutional carry. If you use the actual intent and definitions of these words, keep and bear, keep somewhat alludes to the fact that you should not need a permit to conceal carry a gun. Bear definitely alludes to that. You can keep a weapon and maybe you own it and you're not actually holding it. You don't bear anything without actually holding it. If I own things, I'm not bearing them until I'm actually holding them. So the intent of the Constitution was not just the fact that you could own weapons. It was the very fact that you could actually possess those weapons at any time also if you needed to, especially to defend yourself. Now, we've broken down the simplicity of these words that make up the Second Amendment. And of course, people on the left out there are going to say, oh, you know, that was made 200 years ago, whatever. You know, a lot of things mean the same thing that they did back then. Now we're going to go through case law. I want to explain a couple of things to you. United States versus Miller. There were two gentlemen. One of them's last name was Miller, and the other one was Layton. These guys were going from, I believe it was Oklahoma to Arkansas. These two guys were common thieves. They were petty thieves, not big-time thieves or anything of that nature. And they were, again, going from Oklahoma to Arkansas. They had a sawed-off shotgun in their vehicle. The shotgun was less than 18 inches. Now, this was in 1939. If you remember, the NFA, the National Firearms Act, was passed in 1934. The 1934 NFA actually prohibited you from having a shotgun of less than 18 inches. So you either had to have, well, not either, you had to do both. You had to have a $200 tax stamp and you had to have it registered with the federal government in order for you to legally possess that. Well, Mr. Miller did not have a tax stamp and he had not registered it. So according to the NFA in 1939, he was in illegal possession of a sawed-off shotgun. So he got arrested for it. He went to court and he told everybody that the outlawing of him having this 18-inch or less shotgun was a violation of his Second Amendment. He actually won that case. So the state did not want, or the federal government did not want to allow him to maintain that 18-inch because, again, this was something that the federal government had handed down through the NFA only 4 years earlier. What they did was they sent it to the Supreme Court. Now, the crazy thing was Mr. Miller and Mr. Layton never made it to Supreme Court. In other words, they didn't even go to their Supreme Court case. That's a whole different story. Remember, these guys were criminals. Other things were happening in their lives at that time. But the case itself went to the Supreme Court. And the crazy thing was the Supreme Court technically ruled against us gun owners, or Miller, because what Miller was saying was he was saying that it violated his constitutional right to have a sawed-off shotgun. The Supreme Court at the time actually ruled that it did not violate his Second Amendment rights. And the reason why they ruled that, and this was from the Supreme Court Justice McReynolds, actually wrote this ruling on this. The reasoning behind that was they stated that Mr. Miller had an 18-inch, less than 18-inch sawed-off shotgun, and the intent of the Second Amendment was that we were supposed to be able to possess the same type of weapons that our government possessed. And since the government at that time did not use 18-inch sawed-off shotguns, that Mr. Miller could not possess one without the NFA things that he had to do, the hoops he had to jump through, and that it did not infringe on his Second Amendment rights. Now again, the ruling was against Mr. Miller, but the reasoning behind the ruling was because the government didn't use sawed-off shotguns. Now, the irony of that is the government had fully automatic weapons that they had already passed through the NFA that you and I had to have a tax stamp and register it. But through this own Supreme Court ruling, they were stating that if the government had a certain weapon, that the people had a right to that same weapon. And if the government didn't have it, then that disallowed the people from having the right to that same weapon. That's why the 18-inch sawed-off shotgun was not allowed to Mr. Miller. So again, that was a ruling that was against the gun owner, but really, in my opinion, ruled in favor of gun owners because it proved the fact that we should have the same firearms that the federal government has. Now, let's move on to the next ruling. The next ruling was DC versus Heller. You guys probably remember this. This was in 2008. D.C. versus Heller, I think the guy was a security guard. He lived in Washington, D.C., wanted to have a handgun in his home. Back in 1976, I believe it was, D.C. outlawed handguns because they said that there were so many handguns being used in crimes back then. It had stayed in effect all that time. Heller wanted to have a handgun. He actually applied legally for a handgun and was denied his handgun. They didn't have to give it to you. Even if you qualified for it, they didn't have to. Like a concealed carry in states like Louisiana, it's a shall issue. If you qualify for it, they have to give it to you. They can't decide, no, you can't have it or anything like that. If you qualify, it's yours. D.C. wasn't like that. D.C. was more along the lines, if you qualified for it, we can still decide if you can or can't have it. Well, they did not allow Heller to have it. So Heller took him to court. Went all the way to Supreme Court. The Supreme Court ended up ruling that since handguns were the primarily used handgun of choice for self-defense and for defending oneself, and the fact that D.C. had disallowed Heller from being able to have a handgun in his home to defend himself, that they had violated his constitutional rights because this was a gun that was heavily used, heavily chosen, and preferred to defend oneself, and by not allowing this man to possess one, they were violating his constitutional rights. Folks, the thing that I'm trying to point out more than anything here is the very fact that the Second Amendment is not one run-on sentence that either means militia or the people. It is both. If you will take the time to read it and read it slowly and look at how it's spelled out. Again, court cases back me up on this. This is not my interpretation of the Second Amendment. I just happen to agree with their interpretation of the Second Amendment. But it's two-part. It's two-part. You've got to understand that there's a prefatory statement at the very beginning of it that allows a collective unit to be armed as a militia. And then you have an individual unit at the operative clause in the Second Amendment, the last half of it, that gives all of us the individual right to keep and carry arms on us at all times if we qualify for it, obviously. Folks, we got to get the word out about this. There's too much misinformation going on. Personally, I graduated in 1986. I don't think they teach civics in school anymore. I see too many of these kids out there that don't know what they're talking about. They think that with one fell swoop that you can just get rid of an amendment, not realizing that, two other amendments that are kind of important, the First and the Fourth, those are two that could follow right behind. Believe me, there's a whole lot of people that would like to dismantle the First and the Fourth Amendment also. Obviously, the second one is the one in the crosshairs right now, but the First and the Fourth, there's a bunch of people that would love to dismantle that one. You dismantle the Second Amendment, the First and the Fourth are coming right behind it. And it just blows my mind that so many Americans are so eager to give up their own rights, where they have individual rights that are given to them and granted to them that really they're not anybody's to give. They were your rights to begin with. And people are eager to give those rights up. I simply don't understand it. Instead of focusing on root causes and things that really are causing problems out there in the world, people would prefer to give up a constitutional, inalienable right instead. Guys, please share this. I would greatly appreciate it. Let's get the word out. Let's educate some people. I will tell you that the book I'm reading from right here is a great book, Rights, Liberties, and Justice, Constitutional Law for a Changing America. And if you want another book where you just take it straight from the source, find the Federalist Papers. But what I'm reading from right here, it is literally taking from court cases and spelling them out, and all it's doing is simply giving you the wording and either dissent or what the actual guys wrote, the Supreme Court justices, what they wrote whenever they actually put their rulings out there on these Supreme Court cases. Very interesting to read. I highly recommend reading it. If you get a chance, look at it up online. Most of this stuff is online. That's actually how I found the book several years ago. I was doing some research and I found text from this book and I said, I'm gonna get the whole book. Great book, great reading, gives you a little bit of history on not just the Second Amendment. This thing is chock full of liberties and civil rights and stuff like that from all of the amendments, and gives you an idea of what our framers meant whenever they put all this stuff together. But again, please share it, guys. Let's get the word out. I think we need to share it on anti-gun sites, libertarian sites, pro-gun sites also, because those people can get it out to their friends and family. Again, everything that I have here can be sourced back somewhere. It's not just my opinion. I mean, again, I'm just trying to spell all this out for everybody because I think it's important that if somebody is out there suggesting that they would like to give up their own constitutional rights, I would like to think that they would take the time to watch this video to see what they might be giving up, to understand what they're possibly giving up and what they're suggesting to give up. Guys, we'll see you next time. I appreciate you guys watching.